London, 1928. Inside a quiet laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital, something was growing that absolutely wasn't supposed to be there. When Alexander Fleming returned from a short vacation, he found his Petri dishes exactly as he'd left them. Messy, stacked, and forgotten. Except one of them wasn't normal anymore. A strange mold had invaded the plate. That alone wasn't shocking. Contamination happens all the time. What was shocking was what surrounded it. Around that accidental mold, the bacteria had simply vanished. A clean, invisible halo. As if something inside that fuzzy intruder had declared war, and won. Most scientists would have tossed it in the bin. Fleming didn't. And that hesitation, that quiet pause before cleaning up a mistake, would change medicine forever. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about the experiment itself. Alexander Fleming had been studying Staphylococci, common bacteria responsible for infections that, at the time, could easily turn deadly. His lab at St. Mary's Hospital wasn't some futuristic research center. It was practical, functional, and often cluttered. Petri dishes were part of daily routine. Grow bacteria, observe, record, repeat. That particular plate had simply been left behind before his holiday. No grand design, no controlled breakthrough, just a forgotten culture sitting by an open window, exposed to London air. And somewhere in that ordinary room, an invisible spore drifted in. No alarms, no dramatic moment, just Gents, quietly landing on glass. What happened next wasn't the result of a bold experiment. It was the result of not cleaning up fast enough. When Fleming leaned closer to the contaminated dish, something felt wrong. Not chaotic wrong. Precise wrong. The mold had spread across part of the plate, pale and almost harmless looking. But around it, there was a perfectly defined clearing. A transparent ring where the Staphylococci simply refused to grow. The bacteria were thriving everywhere else. Dense, alive, aggressive, except near the mold. It wasn't random contamination. It was selective. Something inside that intruder was actively killing the microbes around it. Most researchers at the time were focused on strengthening disinfectants, finding harsher chemicals to fight infection. But this wasn't harsh. It was targeted. Quiet. Almost elegant. Instead of throwing the dish away, Fleming did something subtle but critical. He asked a question. What if the mold wasn't the problem? What if it was the solution? The moment of discovery didn't come with applause. It came with a microscope. Alexander Fleming isolated the mold and identified it as belonging to the genus Penicillin. Then he did something simple. He extracted the substance it was releasing and exposed fresh bacteria to it. The result was unmistakable. The bacteria dissolved. Not slowed down. Not weakened. Destroyed. Fleming realized the mold was producing a natural antibacterial agent. He named it penicillin, after the fungus itself. It wasn't a chemical disinfectant. It wasn't toxic to human tissue in the same way existing antiseptics were. It was something radically different. A living organism producing a compound that selectively killed harmful bacteria, not by force, but by biology. And in that quiet lab in London, modern antibiotics had just been born, almost by accident. If this was so powerful, so obvious under a microscope, why hadn't anyone found it before? The answer is uncomfortable, because no one was really looking for it. In 1928, the scientific world wasn't chasing natural antibiotics. The focus was on antiseptics, harsh chemicals poured directly onto wounds. Infection was treated aggressively, often painfully. The idea that a humble mold could outperform laboratory-designed solutions sounded almost naive. And contamination, that was failure. Plates with mold were discarded without a second thought. Fleming didn't discover penicillin because he was searching for it. He discovered it because he paused, because he looked twice. And sometimes, that's the difference between a ruined experiment and a revolution. If you've ever overlooked something small, thinking it didn't matter, stay with me. This is where that small detail begins to rewrite history. But here's the part most people don't know. The world didn't celebrate when Alexander Fleming published his findings in 1929. The reaction was silence. The paper described penicillin's antibacterial properties, but there was a problem. It was unstable, difficult to extract, nearly impossible to produce in useful quantities. In other words, interesting, but impractical. For years, the discovery sat in relative obscurity. Fleming himself couldn't purify it effectively. Without a way to mass-produce the compound, it remained a laboratory curiosity, a promising accident. Nothing more. It would take nearly a decade, and a different team of scientists to realize that this forgotten mold wasn't just a scientific footnote. It was unfinished business. Nearly 10 years later, in the late 1930s, the forgotten paper caught the attention of two scientists at the University of Oxford, Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain. Unlike Fleming, they weren't just intrigued by the bacteria-killing effect. They were obsessed with making it usable. The challenge was enormous. Penicillin was fragile, difficult to isolate, and produced in tiny amounts. Their team worked through makeshift setups, improvising equipment, extracting the compound in painfully small yields, sometimes from gallons of mold culture, just to treat a single patient. But then came the real test. They administered purified penicillin to infected mice. The untreated ones died. The treated ones survived. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It worked. And for the first time, penicillin wasn't just an interesting observation under a microscope. It was a life-saving drug. The first human trials were cautious and desperate. In 1941, a police officer suffering from a severe infection became one of the first patients to receive penicillin. The results were astonishing. His fever dropped. His condition improved. For the first time, a systemic bacterial infection seemed reversible, but there was a brutal limitation. They ran out. There simply wasn't enough penicillin to complete the treatment. Production was painfully slow. Extraction, inefficient. The patient relapsed and died. It was both a breakthrough and a tragedy. That moment made one thing painfully clear. The science worked. The problem was scale. As sports _ event intensified, governments realized what this meant. Infections were killing more soldiers than bullets in some cases. Suddenly, penicillin wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was a strategic priority, and the race to mass produce it had begun. What followed was something the world had never seen before, a scientific sprint under the pressure of war. British and American laboratories collaborated at unprecedented speed. Pharmaceutical companies in the United States re-engineered production methods, using deep fermentation tanks instead of fragile surface cultures. A more productive strain of penicillium was discovered in an unlikely place, a moldy cantaloupe in a market in Illinois. By 1944, penicillin was being mass-produced for Allied troops for the first time in history. Infected wounds that once meant amputation or death became treatable. Survival rates changed dramatically. Battlefield medicine was transformed almost overnight. After the war, penicillin became available to civilians. Hospitals shifted. Life expectancy shifted. Modern antibiotics weren't just improving outcomes. They were redefining what it meant to survive infection at all. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chain stood together to receive the award. It looked like a clean, triumphant ending. But the real story was never about a single genius moment. It was about preparation meeting accident. A forgotten Petri dish, a mold most scientists would have thrown away. A question asked instead of ignored, and years of relentless work to turn possibility into reality. Penicillin didn't just treat infections. It reshaped surgery, childbirth, battlefield medicine, and everyday survival. It marked the beginning of the antibiotic era, a shift so profound that millions of lives since then trace back to that quiet lab in London. The discovery was accidental. The impact was not. And maybe that's the deeper lesson. Breakthroughs don't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes they grow quietly in the background, waiting for someone curious enough to look twice.